Okay, our next realm is the North Africa, Southwest Asia realm. NASWA is kind of just the acronym for that. And we're kind of transitioning from Europe and Russia and Central Asia down to what's often called the Middle East and the northern part of Africa. What kind of, the reason why we don't do Africa as a single realm, we'll talk about that, but the northern part of Africa and what we generally often call the Middle East. Okay, make sure you know the concepts, ideas, and terms for this chapter. I've highlighted a few that we'll talk about, but know the rest as well. I think the list in the current edition of the book is even longer than this. All right, so let's take a wider view of the realm. So we started with North America and worked our way through South America. We recently covered Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and now we're moving into, there's a lot of Asias, by the way, Southwest Asia. So this is Central Asia, we have East Asia over here, South Asia, and then Southwest Asia, which often is, I'll often kind of alternate between calling it that and the Middle East. And then also North Africa here. And if you look at this kind of graphic here, it has this banding, and what that is suggesting is that there's not a really clear geographic boundary between North Africa and what we call sub-Saharan Africa, or Africa south of the Sahara Desert. So if you look at, this is a kind of a gift that alternates between 2 times a year, but what you can see in the satellite view of Africa is a very dry north. This is the Sahara Desert, very sparsely populated, and then as it kind of gets a little greener down here, then you have more people living to the south. So this greener part to the south is sub-Saharan Africa, Africa south of the Sahara. But you also have a concentration of people up along the northern end of the Sahara, like along the Mediterranean Sea. And that part is more historically, culturally connected to places like to other parts of the Southwest Asia, like Saudi Arabia, or what we generally call the Middle East oftentimes. So there's a continuum from the Middle East through Northern Africa. So Northern Africa is kind of collected together with the Middle East or Southwest Asian realm. Then after that, we're going to move south and talk about Africa south of the Sahara, or sub-Saharan Africa. All right, so these are the regions of our realm. We'll just to highlight a little bit. Afghanistan is one that is a place that it could it's also a transitional zone between South Asia and Southwest Asia. But we'll talk about Afghanistan in a future chapter. And then we have what's called the African Transition Zone. So there's kind of a continuum between these realms. And then within the realm, we can kind of look at, these are empire states that were big empires at one time. A region called the Middle East, which is kind of truly the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt and Sudan, and then the Sahara region, including what's called the Maghreb up here. And we'll kind of circle back at the end and take a look at these individual regions. So what's the deal with the name Middle East? Why aren't we just calling it that? Well, just as a little explainer, I found this graphic that this is very European-centric terminology. So in Europe, they consider themselves to be in the West and Asia to be in the East. So Asia is east of Europe. And the closer part of Asia, they call the Near East. The most distant was the Far East, like China, Japan. And then in the middle was the Middle East. And so that label kind of got attached to this part of the world with Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and so forth. However, Southwest Asia is just a little bit more geographically correct, and it's not as European focused. It's more kind of looking at the world as a whole. However, because it's so the term is so commonly used, I often will slip back and use that term in the Middle East, for clarity. And one thing about this part of the world is it's really a crossroads of humanity. And as people, people evolved in Africa, and over millions of years, they evolved there, and then over thousands of years, people have migrated out of Africa to other parts of the world. But this part of the world, this North Africa, Southwest Asia, really a crossroads of human expansion throughout the globe. And also with trade, this is showing the Silk Road, which was an ancient route that connected the West and the East, Asia with Europe. And while parts of the Southwest Asia can be dry and inhospitable, it's also a crossroads between these different parts of the world. We often have conceptions about this part of the world, and the book kind of lays out these questions, and I think it's a good frame for talking about it. Is it a dry world? Is it an Arab world? Is it the Islamic world? And I think that's a good place to start, by trying to break down how it is and is not each one of these things, by kind of explaining what we're talking about here. If we look at population distribution in this part of the world, the Sahara here, remember that's the big desert, very sparsely populated, and but you do have concentrations up here, up near the Mediterranean, along the Nile River in Egypt, and along the Mediterranean in what would be Israel, Syria, and other places. And as you get up a little bit into the more mountainous areas, into Turkey and Iran, it gets a little bit denser from there. But especially here where the Sahara is, or the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, you see where population is very densely concentrated in places. And the reason they're so densely concentrated is because they're concentrated where there's access to water. Access to water means access to food, and that's very important for concentrations of population. Now, that being said, relative to other parts of the world, the population size of the countries in this realm are not that big. They're under or just under 100 million people, where we saw like Brazil, for example, has 200 million people. So Brazil would be over twice the size in terms of population in any one of these countries. So since they're so close, I'd like you to just know these three. The three big ones are Egypt, Turkey, and Iran, each having somewhere between 80 and 100 million people. Turkey and Iran are a little bit further north, more mountainous. They have different kinds of terrain, the population is more evenly distributed. Egypt, on the other hand, is right in the Sahara, so its population is concentrated along the Nile River. Here's a closer view of that. And again, this is similar to the graphic I showed before, but I think it highlights it a little better, that you have these parts of this part of the world that there's not that many people, and then there's high concentrations where there is access to water and agriculture.